The rain had started as a drizzle that afternoon in Fairpine, Oregon, the kind that dampened the pavement but not the mood, and 13-year-old Natalie Kearns walked home alone beneath a polka-dotted umbrella that bounced slightly with her step. Her yellow windbreaker made her easy to spot against the grey sky and damp sidewalks, a flash of colour cutting through the small town's quiet routine. It was April 13th, 1993, a Tuesday, and she had stayed after school for the poetry club, something she had only just begun attending, her notebook filled with half-finished lines and flower doodles. The last person to see her was the librarian, who remembered her checking out a book about constellations and thanking her in that quiet, polite voice Natalie was known for. A neighbor saw her walk past the corner bakery, her umbrella tilted just slightly in the wind, her eyes watching the passing cars but never stopping. By the time the school bus made its final route and Natalie's father pulled into the driveway from his job at the lumber mill, her absence was noticeable. Her mother, Evelyn, stood at the window wiping her hands on a dish towel, staring at the porch steps as if expecting her daughter to materialize from the fog. When she didn't come home for dinner, they called the school, then the sheriff, and then everyone they could think of, the panic multiplying with each minute that passed. The search began that night, flashlights bobbing through trees and voices calling her name into darkness that had never felt so heavy. Strangers and friends alike walked ditches and combed the woods behind the school, and dogs barked through thickets that led nowhere. The umbrella was never found. Neither was the book about stars. Flyers went up with her school photo, her braces barely visible in a shy smile, and her favorite quote written underneath in her own handwriting. Something about the moon always being there, even when you can't see it. Weeks passed, and then months, and though leads came in, sightings in other towns, stories from truckers, even a psychic from California, nothing ever held. Evelyn kept her bedroom untouched, brushing the covers smooth each morning, as if Natalie might still need them that night. Her father, Richard, stopped talking much and eventually lost his job after too many missed days and empty stares. Time moved forward like it does in towns too used to grief. By 1996, Natalie's case file had been shelved with the others, her name whispered only in passing, and her photo faded in the sun of the sheriff's window. Some kids at the school started calling the road she vanished on Ghost Stretch, and new students were told not to walk alone there. Not because of any rule, but because of a story no one wanted to believe could happen twice. But it had happened once, and for the Kearns family, once was enough to break the world in half. The man who won the unit had not expected much, just a last-minute bid on a rusting metal door in a row of forgotten storage lots off Route 7, the kind of place where people leave behind old furniture and bad memories. It was drizzling that morning in Fairpine, as if the sky itself remembered something the rest of the town had buried, and the lock on Unit 47 groaned when cut, falling to the concrete like a small surrender. Inside, the space was musty and packed tight, boxes stacked beneath a faded child's tricycle, a broken lamp with a duck-shaped base, and a half-collapsed couch that smelled of mildew and mothballs. The new owner, a local named Drew Connolly, who flipped units for weekend cash, began sorting through the dust and disuse with mild disappointment until he found a locked black case wedged between two plastic bins marked Christmas and Crafts. The latch creaked open after some effort with a screwdriver, revealing a handheld camcorder wrapped in an old towel, the battery corroded, but the tape still inside. Drew brought it home, out of curiosity more than hope, and connected it to an adapter his wife still had from her college film class. When the screen came to life, the footage flickered through static before stabilizing into something hauntingly mundane. A sidewalk, a gray sky, and a girl in a yellow windbreaker walking beneath a polka-dotted umbrella. The image wobbled slightly, as if the camera had been hidden behind something, watching. She moved past the frame slowly, unaware, the picture grainy but unmistakable. Natalie. Even after 32 years, the town had not forgotten the shape of that jacket or the way her ponytail swung. The camcorder's timestamp read 3:41 p.m., April 13th, 1993. The precise moment she had vanished. Drew paused the footage, staring at the date in stunned silence before calling his wife into the room. She gasped when she saw the girl's face, her hand flying to her mouth, and said one word that echoed in Drew's chest like a dropped stone: Natalie. The camera kept rolling for several more seconds after the girl passed, then cut to black. No sound, no voice, just the cold mechanical whir of the machine doing what it was built to do: record without judgment. Drew reported it to the sheriff the next morning, and by nightfall, Unit 47 was swarming with forensic techs in reflective vests and latex gloves, combing through boxes that had suddenly become evidence. The news spread fast. Fairpine had not spoken Natalie's name in years with any real hope, but now her face returned to every television screen and front page, not as a cautionary tale, but as a question newly sharpened. Why was a tape of her last known steps hidden in a storage unit no one remembered renting? And who had been holding the camera when she walked by? The unit had stood untouched for over a decade, its monthly payments deducted from a closed bank account until the funds dried up and the company finally marked it for auction. When investigators traced the lease paperwork back, the name Ray Garrison surfaced, a man most in Fairpine barely remembered, and those who did recalled only in vague terms, as the quiet janitor who kept to himself, spoke in murmurs, and avoided eye contact in the school halls. He had died in 2011 from a heart attack in his modest rental on the edge of town, alone, with no listed next of kin. The coroner's report noted little more than age, cause of death, and that the man's fridge held nothing but condiments and expired milk. His obituary was a single line in the Fairpine ledger, squeezed between classified ads and church notices. Nobody had ever questioned what happened to his belongings, because nobody thought to ask. But now, the contents of Unit 47 took on a different weight, no longer random junk, but a sealed chamber of time that might hold answers. The task force reopened the unit under strict chain of custody protocols, cataloguing everything down to the rusted screws in the tool chest. They found stacks of school newsletters from the early 90s, their corners curled with age, a box of VHS tapes labeled only with numbers, and a red binder filled with laminated floor plans of the Fairpine Middle School building. One box contained faded report cards belonging to students whose names no longer rang familiar, until one did: Natalie Kearns. Her name was underlined in blue ink, a paperclip fastening her photo ID from the yearbook to a disciplinary slip that read, "Left class early, unexcused." The discovery turned the search from passive observation to active suspicion. Garrison had never been a suspect. He had passed background checks, lived a quiet life, and died without fanfare. But now, his careful storage of school materials, especially those related to Natalie, suggested something else, perhaps obsession, perhaps guilt. Investigators found one item that chilled them most, tucked inside a manila envelope wedged behind a stack of Christmas lights. It was a photo taken from a distance of Natalie on the school playground, the image grainy and off-center like it had been captured through a window or behind a tree. No one knew when it had been taken, but the date scrawled on the back matched the week before she vanished. As detectives examined the box more closely, they realized many of the items were grouped into themes: school, holidays, home repairs, as if someone had organized not for convenience, but for control. Garrison's death had closed the door on his story, but now it reopened like a creaking hinge, and what lay behind it was no longer benign. The janitor who once swept the halls now stood, in absentia, at the center of a case that was no longer cold, only waiting. The tape, once thought to be a static relic, proved more alive than anyone expected. After showing Natalie in her yellow windbreaker, clutching the polka-dotted umbrella as she trudged alone through the downpour, the footage didn't end. Instead, the camcorder remained steady, recording from what appeared to be inside a parked vehicle, the windshield wipers ticking across the frame with a slow, almost metronomic rhythm. Raindrops splattered the glass, blurring the edges of the picture, but the figure outside remained unmistakable. Natalie paused near a corner where the sidewalk curved into a gravel shoulder, her head turning sharply at the sound of an approaching engine. A dark-colored sedan rolled into frame from the right, its headlights dull in the gloom. The car idled for a moment, then the passenger side window lowered slightly, revealing little more than a shadowed face behind the glass. Natalie hesitated, shifting her weight between her feet, the umbrella trembling slightly in her hand. She glanced once behind her, down the street toward home, then back to the car. After a pause that felt eternal on playback, she took a step forward, then another, then reached for the door handle. The last image before the tape cut to black was her bent figure climbing inside. No struggle, no visible coercion, just a girl who seemed uncertain but not terrified, stepping into a vehicle she may have recognized. Analysts combed the footage for clues, freezing frames and enhancing resolution in a lab thick with silence and fluorescent light. They caught a partial plate, Oregon tag, ending in 94K. The make appeared to be a Mercury Grand Marquis, a model popular in the early 90s, boxy and forgettable to most eyes, but distinctive to a trained one. The paint looked either black or a very dark green, hard to tell through the watery blur. The footage changed everything. What had once been whispers and fading missing posters was now a live-action lead, a girl's last visible choice preserved in magnetic tape. The vehicle, assumed long out of circulation, became the centerpiece of a regional manhunt. DMV archives were pulled, defunct plates checked, local junkyards and auctions cross-referenced. Former residents were contacted, insurance records reviewed, and mechanics interviewed in case the car had been serviced locally. The idea that the camera had been intentionally placed, recording not just happenstance but a plan unfolding, began to sink in like cold water. This was not an accidental capture. Someone had been waiting, watching from behind the lens as the rain fell and the girl made her decision. The camcorder, left locked away in a unit that should have been forgotten, now screamed of calculation. It filmed from a fixed angle, low to the dashboard, as if the camera had been set up ahead of time. Investigators realized they were not just seeing Natalie's last moments. They were witnessing someone's twisted documentary, carefully staged, methodically archived, and quietly sealed in metal walls for reasons no one yet understood. The house on Sycamore Lane had aged around Evelyn Kearns like a slow collapse, its paint peeling in corners, its porch creaking louder each spring, but inside it remained frozen in the year her daughter disappeared. Natalie's posters still clung to her bedroom walls with yellowing tape, her pink hairbrush still sat on the vanity with a few strands caught in the bristles, and her bed, neatly made beneath a faded quilt, looked as if it were waiting for her to crawl into it after school and complain about algebra or her locker jammed again. Evelyn, now in her late 60s, moved through that space like a ghost of her own making, her days shaped by the rituals of memory. She vacuumed around the same scuff marks Natalie had left with rollerblades, kept the fridge stocked with her daughter's favorite yogurt even though no one ate it, and watered a hanging plant by the window that had long since died but never been removed. When the detectives arrived in 2025 with a laptop and the grainy footage queued up, Evelyn sat at the kitchen table in the same chair she had occupied the night Natalie didn't come home. At first, she refused to watch. Her hands trembled near the mug she kept full, even when she forgot to drink it. Her gaze fixed somewhere above the tiled counter, as if looking at the past required more strength than she could summon. But the second she heard the faint, familiar shuffle of Natalie's footsteps on the audio, something broke. She leaned in, eyes wide and glassy, and when the dark sedan appeared on screen, she let out a sound that did not belong to language, something raw and guttural that came from the part of her that had never healed. It took her a long time to speak, but when she did, her voice was low and hoarse, as if it had been waiting years to say what followed. 2 weeks before Natalie disappeared, Evelyn had found an envelope slipped into their mailbox with no stamp, no return address, and her daughter's name printed on the front in block letters. Inside was a single sheet of paper bearing a typed message that read, "You think no one sees you, but we do. Stay quiet, stay good, or else." At the time, Evelyn had dismissed it as a cruel prank, maybe from a classmate with a grudge or some anonymous bully, the sort of nasty joke children play without understanding how deeply fear can cut. She never told Natalie, never alerted the police, just threw it away and washed her hands 3 times afterward. Now, in the flickering shadows of the old footage, she realized her silence had been the start of something far worse. The room felt smaller after the confession, as if the house itself knew what had been ignored, and the quiet between mother and screen stretched on like a punishment neither of them could outlive. The journal was found in a dust-covered box marked Classroom 1993 in the attic of a retired teacher's bungalow, wedged between faded yearbooks and broken chalk holders. The house had sat vacant since Margaret Lane, Natalie's 8th grade English teacher, passed away the previous winter. Her niece, tasked with clearing the estate, came across the box and handed it over to authorities almost as an afterthought, not knowing that inside its tattered leather spine sat a fragment of time that might finally breathe life into a case that had lingered like an open wound for over 30 years. The handwriting in the journal was neat, cursive, and pressed down hard, as if Margaret had always meant her words to last. Most of the entries were ordinary, reflections on books assigned, passing observations about restless students and the rhythms of spring. But near the back, dated April 9th, 1993, the ink seemed darker, more deliberate. "Something feels off," the entry began, a line that trembled with weight in hindsight. Margaret wrote about a man she'd seen more than once near the school playground. He never came inside, never approached the gates, but he lingered by the fence or across the street, always alone, always watching. At first, she thought he might be a parent waiting in a car or a neighbor walking his dog, but he came back the next day and the next, and what unsettled her most was that his eyes never seemed to scan the crowd. They always locked on one child, Natalie Kearns. She described the man as average in build, maybe in his 40s, with thinning dark hair and an oversized green coat. She noted how Natalie had seemed more withdrawn that week, slower to raise her hand in class, distracted by something just beyond the windows. Margaret had even asked her gently if everything was okay, but Natalie only smiled in that polite, practiced way that children use when they are too scared or too loyal to speak the truth. The entry ended with a line that gave every investigator pause. "If I were her mother, I'd ask who's waiting for her outside." The journal was passed hand to hand in the cold, fluorescent light of the station, each reader growing stiller as they reached the end. It was not proof, not a name or a plate number, but it was a witness, and in a case like Natalie's, witnesses had long since vanished or forgotten. The journal changed the rhythm of the investigation. It redirected eyes toward the school's periphery, toward who may have circled rather than entered, and cast a new shadow over the neighborhood that once thought itself too quiet for danger. The words of a teacher, scribbled in the margin of her daily life, had become louder than any siren that had ever raced through Fairpine, and in their echo was the unmistakable sound of someone who had seen something real and left a warning that was nearly too late. The tip came through a faded postcard taped to the back of an old ledger found in Ray Garrison's storage unit, the kind motel owners used to record cash payments and license plate numbers in cramped handwriting. The address on the card led investigators 20 miles outside Fairpine, down a forgotten stretch of highway where even the trees leaned with weariness. The sign above the building had long since lost its paint, but the letters barely visible beneath the grime read Hilltop Haven, a name that now felt cruel in its irony. The motel had been shuttered since the late 90s, reclaimed by rust and weeds, but room 17 stood out. Its door had been reinforced with a second lock and the window covered in thick black plastic. Inside, the air was dense with mildew, dust floating like ash in the shaft of sunlight that spilled through a hole in the ceiling. The walls had once been painted a cheerful yellow, now faded and peeling like forgotten intentions. On the far wall, beneath a crooked curtain rod, were children's drawings, crayon scribbles of stick figures and houses, all signed in the bottom right corner with looping letters. N.K. A mattress lay on the floor, covered in a faded blanket patterned with cartoon bears. There was no light fixture, only a bare bulb dangling from a frayed wire that swayed slightly, as if remembering motion. Investigators found a small plastic comb, a pink shoelace, and a cracked Walkman in the corner. Each item was bagged carefully, like relics from a lost world. Outside, just beyond the reach of the parking lot, a patch of disturbed earth caught the attention of the forensic team. The soil was softer there, its composition different than the surrounding ground, and when probed, revealed traces of human decomposition. It was not a grave in the ceremonial sense, more like a hole hurriedly filled and left to disappear under grass and time. The forensic dogs alerted twice, once at the spot near the lot, and again by the edge of the woods where a child's coat button was recovered. For the first time since the video surfaced, authorities no longer spoke of Natalie in terms of missing. The language shifted, quietly and collectively, from hope to confirmation, from maybe to likely. Ray Garrison, the quiet janitor with no family and no history of complaints, had owned the motel under an alias, and records showed it had remained in his name until his death. The revelation cracked something open in Fairpine, a new narrative, whispered between neighbors and gasps at grocery checkouts, began to replace the myth of a girl who simply disappeared. She had been taken, hidden, kept somewhere not far from where she was loved and searched for. And now, in the flicker of old videotape and the scent of disturbed soil, her story was rising from the ground like steam after rain. The second tape was smaller, tucked into a dented cereal box, beneath a stack of outdated tax returns and brittle family photographs that had curled at the edges like autumn leaves. It wasn't labeled, just sealed in an old Ziploc bag clouded with dust, as though whoever hid it knew exactly what it contained and didn't want anyone to find it unless they were desperate enough to search every corner. When the footage flickered to life on a grainy monitor in the evidence lab, the room fell silent except for the whirring of the VCR and the soft, rhythmic clicking of a pen someone forgot to stop clicking. The timestamp read April 15th, 1993, 2 days after Natalie Kearns vanished. The scene opened not on a street or sidewalk, but inside a dimly lit room. A single bulb hung from the ceiling, its light swaying slightly as if disturbed by a passing breeze, casting uneven shadows along walls that looked stained and peeling. Natalie was there, sitting cross-legged on a mattress without sheets, wearing the same yellow windbreaker from the earlier footage, though now it was zipped all the way to her chin. Her face looked pale, thinner than the photos that had become standard in every missing child's report, and her hair hung limply over her shoulder, partially hiding her expression. She wasn't crying, but her eyes held a kind of stillness that only comes from fear grown familiar. She looked into the camera like she was trying to see through it, to reach past the lens and find someone on the other side who could pull her out. Her lips moved slowly, forming words that couldn't be heard over the hum of the tape's background noise. Audio technicians would later isolate the sound and identify only one word with clarity: home. But in that moment, no one spoke. Behind her, a shadow moved across the back wall, large and sudden, not entering the frame fully, but enough to jolt her posture. She stiffened, then lowered her gaze to the floor. Whoever or whatever was in the room with her remained unseen, just out of reach, but undeniably present, like thunder that rumbles too close without showing its lightning. The camera did not turn off. It stayed fixed on her, as though someone wanted to study her, not document her. When the screen finally went black, it didn't fade. It stopped mid-frame, freezing her face in a moment of half-breath and unspoken terror. Investigators stared at the paused image longer than they meant to, each person in the room caught in the eerie weight of watching someone who had not known she was being watched. The tape was copied, secured, and labeled for evidence, but the original was placed back in its bag with a reverence usually reserved for relics or the newly dead. Natalie Kearns was no longer just a missing girl. She had been seen, she had been heard, and someone, somewhere, had chosen to record her fear instead of free her. The old bus route map had long been boxed up in a district archive room, buried beneath decades of forgotten policies and yellowing attendance records. But when investigators spread it out on the table, it told a story no one had fully read before. Red ink marked the usual path, a steady zigzag through the quiet neighborhoods of Fairpine, with dots and initials beside each stop like breadcrumbs through a once safe forest. But in the margins, barely visible unless the light hit it right, someone had crossed out a location and written a new one in faded pencil. It was a small shift on paper, less than a mile's difference, but it had changed everything. That stop, added just 3 weeks before Natalie Kearns disappeared, was near the edge of town by a shuttered gas station that had gone out of business around the same time. Curious and unsettled, investigators tracked down Roger Dell, a retired driver who had spent 27 years behind the wheel of Bus 42. Now in his 80s and living in a modest assisted living facility, Roger spoke with a gravelly hesitation, as though he had been carrying something he never meant to say aloud. He recalled the change vividly, said it struck him as odd even back then because rerouting required paperwork that never crossed his desk. When asked who gave the order, he glanced toward the window like the answer might be written in the sky, then finally said it was a school administrator, someone who phrased it not as a request, but as a quiet favor. "They told me not to worry," he muttered, voice trembling. "Just said a parent wanted to pick their kid up there instead. No reason to fuss." When pressed further, Roger admitted the car had been a dark sedan, black or navy, hard to tell in the fog that morning. He remembered the driver never stepping out, just cracking the window and giving a quick wave. What chilled him now was the certainty that it happened more than once, always the same time, always the same car, and always Natalie. She would get on the bus, ride a few stops, then quietly ask to be let off at the alternate location. He had assumed her mother approved, maybe even arranged it. But Evelyn Kearns had never mentioned such a thing, and denied it with the kind of grief-stricken clarity that left no room for doubt. The records from that year showed no official alteration to the route, no form signed, no administrator named. Whatever arrangement had been made, it was off the books and now deeply suspect. Investigators began cross-referencing staff who worked in the office at the time, comparing car registrations, looking for anyone with access to both Natalie's school schedule and the authority to manipulate the transportation log. What had once seemed like a logistical footnote now stood out like a wound, and the question grew louder with every uncovered detail. Who had made the change? And why had no one stopped it? The car had been sitting in a county impound lot for over 3 decades, its once sleek exterior dulled by time and dust, a silent witness to something no one had bothered to see until now. Tucked in the far corner of the chain-linked yard, its black paint flaked in places and the windshield fogged from years of Oregon rain and neglect, the 1989 Lincoln Town car had long ago stopped being considered evidence. It had been towed in 1994 after being found abandoned near the banks of the Santiam River, a place locals used to fish but rarely visited after the mill closed. At the time, the vehicle raised few eyebrows. There had been no missing persons case directly tied to it. No blood, no obvious crime. Just an empty car with no plates, its registration wiped clean, and its owner never stepping forward. It was logged and stored like so many other forgotten machines waiting for auction or parts. But when the partial plate from the storage unit video was finally run again through updated systems and cross-checked against every impounded car from the 90s, a match lit up like a flare in the dark. Investigators drove out to the lot with gloved hands and a new sense of urgency, cracking open the warped door of the old Lincoln with the care reserved for time capsules or coffins. The interior was a time capsule of its own, crumbled seat foam, brittle upholstery, and the unmistakable stench of mildew and something else underneath it, something chemical and sour. Beneath the passenger seat, wedged deep into the rusted springs, was a single strand of hair, light brown and brittle but still intact enough to be tested. It took less than a week for the lab to confirm what no one wanted to say out loud until it was printed in black and white. The hair belonged to Natalie Kearns. She had been in that car, and given its abandonment just months after her disappearance, it was likely the same vehicle caught on the camcorder tape. The question of who drove it remained painfully open. No fingerprints survived the decades of rot and exposure, and the VIN had been filed down, likely by someone who knew exactly how to erase a name from a record. The only clue left was a cigarette butt found in the ashtray, too old for DNA extraction, but marked by a distinct brand no longer sold in Oregon after 1995. Small, quiet details that told a story only when someone was willing to listen to whispers. The car, now cordoned off and carefully examined, became a shrine of sorts for Evelyn Kearns, who visited the lot in silence, her hand resting on the hood like it was the closest she would ever come to holding her daughter again. The past, once buried in rust and rain, had surfaced at last, dragging with it a terrible clarity. Natalie had been taken, held and moved, and someone had made sure the car, like the truth, stayed hidden in plain sight. The discovery came like a whisper from the past, buried under layers of dust and forgetfulness. As investigators returned to the storage unit for another round of cataloging, one officer leaned against the back wall and noticed something odd. The echo didn't match the rest of the space. A tap, a hollow sound, a seam that should not have been there. When the wall panel was gently pried open, it revealed a narrow gap no wider than a crawl space, stuffed with old newspapers, broken toys, and a faded purple backpack. The zipper had rusted shut, and the cloth smelled like rot and mildew, but the initials stitched in pink thread near the front pocket were still visible, LMH. That was how they found her again, the girl who had gone missing in 1989 from a town just 40 miles away. Lisa Marie Hanley, 12 years old, last seen walking home from choir practice in Northwood, had vanished without a trace just 4 years before Natalie. Her case had been a short burst of headlines, a few months of flyers on lampposts, then faded into the silence that always came too soon when the trail went cold. No one ever connected her to Fairpine. No one had reason to. Until now. Inside the backpack were a few school papers, a broken plastic hairbrush, and a locket with a photo of her and her younger brother. The bag had not been thrown in carelessly. It had been placed, tucked like something worth hiding but not destroying. When Lisa's mother, now a tired woman living in assisted housing with thinning grey hair and arthritic hands, was told the backpack had been found, she wept so hard they thought she might collapse. She had never remarried, never moved, and had long stopped talking about her daughter because no one ever asked anymore. The connection between Lisa and Natalie was impossible to ignore. Both girls were young, pre-teens with similar builds and light brown hair, both vanished on rainy weekdays, both walking alone. The idea that one man may have crossed counties and years to target the same kind of child sent a cold ripple through everyone working the case. The media latched on, dubbing him the Shadow Collector, a name that made the public pay attention again, but brought little comfort to those who knew the girls' real names. This false wall had not only concealed evidence, but stitched together stories that had once lived in separate chapters, drawing a cruel thread through two families who had thought they were alone in their grief. It was not just about Natalie anymore. Lisa's file was reopened, new DNA samples were pulled from the locket, and the investigation spread like spilled ink. There was someone who had made these girls disappear, who had hidden their memories behind plywood and silence, and who had, somehow, managed to stay forgotten. But now, with two names, two faces, and one shared grave of a storage unit, the truth had started to wake up. Evelyn sat in the worn armchair by the window, the late afternoon light casting long shadows across the carpet, her hands trembling in her lap as if the truth she had carried for more than 3 decades had finally grown too heavy to keep inside. The living room was quiet, except for the distant hum of traffic and the soft ticking of the mantel clock, each second punctuating the silence that had stretched between her and the two detectives seated across from her. She did not look at them as she began to speak, her voice fragile but clear, like the edge of a cracked teacup that still held its shape. She told them about a time long before the marriage, before Natalie, before Fairpine became the center of a tragedy no one would forget. Back when she was barely out of high school and still figuring out who she was, she had dated Ray Garrison for a short while. He had been quiet, older, strange even then, with a habit of watching people a little too long and speaking in circles when asked direct questions. She had ended it after only a few months, put off by his possessiveness and the way he talked about fate and purity like it was something he could shape with his hands. She had never told anyone, not her husband, not her parents, not even her closest friend, ashamed of how close she had come to a man who would later become a ghost in her daughter's story. Now, staring at the photo of Natalie taped to the wall beside the television, Evelyn said she believed Ray had convinced himself that Natalie was his child. He must have done the math, looked at the timing, the similarities, the way Natalie's eyes reflected his own delusions, and decided she was his to protect. And maybe, in his twisted mind, he thought he was saving her. From what, Evelyn did not know. Maybe from a father Ray deemed unworthy. Maybe from a life Ray thought was too ordinary or too corrupt. Maybe from Evelyn herself. The thought made her chest tighten. She pressed her palm against it, eyes blinking back tears that had been threatening for hours. One of the detectives leaned forward and asked gently why she had never come forward before. She shook her head slowly, her gray hair catching the light. "Because I thought I had buried that part of my life," she said, "and I never imagined it would dig its way back up through my daughter." The room stayed still after that, heavy with the realization that sometimes the things we hide in silence come back louder than we ever imagined. Her confession did not close the case, but it cracked something open that had been sealed tight for too long. And in that crack, there was the faintest glimmer of understanding, not forgiveness, not yet, but the shape of something closer to truth. The second tape, already heavy with dread, was brought into the forensic lab again, this time treated with the same precision reserved for historic evidence that might crumble if touched too roughly. The technicians slowed the footage frame by frame, each pause revealing details that the naked eye could never catch at normal speed. Natalie sat on the mattress, her face pale and drawn, her eyes darting towards something beyond the camera, as if she sensed a presence lurking just outside the shot. Behind her, the dimly lit room reflected faint shapes on a small, cracked mirror hanging on the wall. And it was there, in that warped reflection, that they found the face. It appeared only for a fraction of a second, half-shadowed and angled downward, but the sharp lines of his jaw, the narrow bridge of his nose, and the peculiar way his hair parted all matched one man. Ray Garrison. The forensic team ran a facial recognition scan using old employee photos from the school district archives, and the match came back at 98%. The grainy image did not just suggest his presence, it confirmed it. He was there in that room with Natalie. As they slowed the footage even further, a faint sound emerged from the background, almost buried beneath the static hiss of the tape. It was not music or a voice, but something mechanical and haunting, a low wailing noise that rose and fell like an old siren. It took a moment for anyone to place it, but one of the older officers recognized it immediately as the testing signal used on civil defense shelters that were decommissioned in the 1980s. That single sound narrowed the possible filming locations to a handful of underground structures built during the Cold War, most of which had been left to rot beneath the overgrowth and silence outside Fairpine. The realization settled like a stone in the room. The shelter, likely abandoned for decades, had been repurposed by someone who knew it would remain hidden from casual eyes, its entrance buried under brush or debris. Investigators pored over old county maps and property records, tracing each shelter built within a 50-mile radius and marking the ones close to routes Ray Garrison would have known from his work as a janitor and part-time groundskeeper. The image of his face, caught almost accidentally in the mirror's reflection, felt like a ghost pointing a finger from beyond the grave. Evelyn Kearns was told of the finding, and she sat quietly, hands clasped, saying nothing because in some small, terrible way she had already known it would come back to him. The tape, once just an eerie artifact, had now become a confession in moving images. Every second of static felt like the sound of a clock winding back to 1993, to the day a girl in a yellow jacket walked into the rain and never returned. The forest was quieter than it should have been, the kind of silence that feels rehearsed, like the trees had long ago learned to keep secrets. The search team had combed the area for days, following the decades-old blueprints of Cold War-era civil defense structures and narrowing them down with aerial scans and ground-penetrating radar until one spot stood out, a moss-covered clearing in the northern pines, where the earth dipped just enough to suggest something hidden below. Tucked behind layers of bramble and collapsed branches, they found a steel hatch rusted around the hinges and covered in pine needles thick enough to seem intentional. The air that rose when they pried it open was stale and sharp, like old rot sealed in time. A narrow ladder descended into darkness, and when the first flashlight beam cut through the gloom, it revealed walls lined with flaking concrete and water stains that traced the years like the rings of a tree. At the far end of the shelter, they found what they had been fearing. A shallow depression in the floor held skeletal remains curled into themselves, the bones small and fragile, the silence in the room abruptly heavier. Near the remains, folded neatly and impossibly bright against the dust, was Natalie's yellow windbreaker, faded but unmistakable, the same one she had worn the day she disappeared. Her polka-dotted umbrella lay nearby, snapped in half but still recognizable, its handle worn smooth from time, or hands, or both. One of the detectives crouched near the corner of the shelter, where a small metal box had been placed beneath a stack of tattered magazines. Inside was a piece of notebook paper, edges browned and soft, the ink faint but legible. In a looping, childlike scrawl, it read, "I tried to leave. He said I was safest here." The words struck harder than any official finding could have, carrying a weight that no report would ever fully capture. It was a goodbye, or a record, or perhaps a hope that someone, someday, would find her truth. The forensic team confirmed the remains were Natalie's, and the shelter, likely built to protect lives, had instead entombed one. When Evelyn was told, she sat on the porch of the house she had never left, the house where Natalie's room remained untouched, and she stared at the trees as if they were capable of apology. Reporters would soon descend, the headlines would return, and experts would debate how such a place went undiscovered for so long. But in that moment, the only thing that mattered was the silence finally broken. Natalie had not just vanished. She had tried. She had left a mark. And in the end, they had heard her. The forest no longer held her alone. The ground had given up its secret. The past had spoken. In the spring of 2026, when the dogwoods bloomed early and the breeze through Fairpine carried more warmth than regret, the town gathered beneath a canvas sky to witness the unveiling of a memorial that had taken over 3 decades to deserve. It stood at the edge of Willow Park, where the creek curved like a cradle, and the town's oldest elm reached crooked branches toward heaven. The memorial was simple, just 2 stone pillars side by side, engraved not with dates or summaries, but with names. Natalie Kearns and Amelia Breyer, the girl from 1989, whose case had almost disappeared into dust. Beneath their names was a single sentence in bronze. They were never forgotten, only waiting to be heard. The crowd was quiet when the cloth slipped away and sunlight caught the lettering just right, casting the names in gold as if the town was finally willing to say them aloud without flinching. Schoolchildren stood beside retired detectives, mothers with strollers next to men who had once searched the riverbanks with flashlights and old maps, everyone bound together by the weight of what had once been silence. At the reception in the town hall, a flat screen looped the trailer for Time Locked, the upcoming documentary that had stirred national attention, combining archival footage with new interviews, threading together the pieces of a mystery that had outlived its urgency, but never its ache. Inside the local museum, the very storage unit that had reignited the case had been reconstructed in full detail, glass-walled and climate-controlled, with the camcorder, the cereal box, and even the yellow jacket resting beneath soft lights like relics. Visitors stood with hands over their mouths, reading Evelyn's handwritten note about the porch light and how many bulbs she had changed since 1993. And across town, that same house, paint peeling, shutters weathered, the wind chime on the porch still clinking against itself, sat a little quieter than it used to. On that evening, for the first time in 33 years, Evelyn Kearns walked to the front door and reached for the switch near the coat rack. She hesitated, her fingers trembling, then turned off the porch light that had burned through every season, every thunderstorm, every hour of grief and hope and hollowness. The bulb flickered once before surrendering to the dark, and in that quiet, Evelyn whispered her daughter's name, not in mourning, but in release. Natalie's room would remain untouched, but now it was memory, not vigil. The town had finally said her name, the truth had finally risen like sap through old wood, and the girl in the yellow jacket was no longer just a cautionary tale passed between neighbors. She was real again, named and known, and her story would be told not in whispers, but in light.